the School of Public Health before joining UNC's Department of Social Medicine. He is broadly interested in the history of medicine and science, sexual and reproductive health, and Latin America. Presently, he is researching the history of cervical cancer in the Andean region and is the co-author of a new book entitled Peripheral Nerve, Health and Medicine in Cold War Latin America. His talk today is entitled Not Born Yesterday, Anti-Cancer Activism in Early 20th Century Latin America. After his presentation, we will be opening up the session to Q&A, so please submit any questions you have for Dr. Necochea to the Q&A box. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Lorena, for that kind introduction, and welcome everybody to my birthday celebration. I want to show you today some work in progress on the role of medical activists promoting the first cancer control efforts in Latin America between the 1910s and the 1940s, using primarily evidence from Peru, which is my home country. As well as the question that this activism raises for global health research. I first became interested in this topic when I was working on my first book on the history of family planning. At that time, which was about 10 years ago, I noticed that governmental cervical cancer prevention programs in several Latin American countries in the 1970s were linked to family planning programs. And I wondered how that intertwining came to be between cervical cancer control and family planning. Cervical cancer is still very threatening in the global south. It is now kin to other infectious cancers such as hepatitis B and C virus-related liver cancer, H. pylori-related stomach cancer, AIDS-related Kaposi sarcoma, and human papilloma virus-related anal and head and neck cancers, as well as cervical cancer, of course. The problem of cancer contagiousness has brought back the old logic of containment through policies such as migration restriction and vaccination, something that historians have addressed quite well for other topics in the history of infectious illness. Cervical cancer care has been a grim puzzle for Latin American health workers for more than a century, linking policies, financial and technical resources, and professional attitudes. Our current knowledge about HPV has radically transformed our understanding of the etiology and epidemiology of cervical cancer and also resulted in vaccines that can prevent infection with some strains of HPV. But to what extent have we moved past older institutions, attitudes, and technologies that used to define our approach to such a deadly disease? That's the big question that this project deals with. And what I want to show you today is one part of it. So here we go. In a 1922 letter to the editor of London's Pall Mall Gazette, the Peruvian physician Juan José Mostajo addressed the shortcomings of Britain's cancer control campaign. And what he said was, in spite of intense labor, the causes of cancer still remain unknown, nor have the labors begun 25 years ago at the Imperial Cancer Research Center and still proceeding under Dr. James Alexander Murray resulted in any appreciable advance being made. Dr. Mostajo, the Peruvian, was in London as part of a long trip through Latin America, Europe, and the United States to gauge how different governments and organizations tackled the threat of cancer. Like other Latin American physicians at the time, he supported enrolling a broad coalition of state health agencies, physicians, and lay people in campaigns to broadcast the early signs of the disease. This man, Mostajo, was instrumental in bringing about precisely that kind of broad mobilization, beginning in 1918 as an institution called the AntiCancer League, the Liga Anticancerosa. Unfortunately, the public outreach scheme of the LAC, after its initials in Spanish, it ground to a halt by 1926 and only restarted in the late 1930s within the Instituto Nacional del Cáncer, the National Cancer Institute in Peru, which sidelined the older LAC and weakened its plan of action. So the smaller question that I'm going to deal with today is, how did that dismissal, sidelining, and weakening happen? How did the Liga Anticancerosa, the Anti-Cancer League, lose out? I am going to spare you the backstory of the 19th century in terms of cancer care. Oh, sorry, of the backstory of the 18th and the 19th century in Peru. But let me just say that medical discussion about cancer care were already quite common in Peruvian medical circles in the 18th century. That said, there was an important event that I need to plug in right around the year 1895 with the establishment of the Professorship of Gynecology at Peru's main faculty of medicine, the one at San Marcos University. There, Dr. Constantino de Carvalho, whose photo you see there, became the appointee of the Professorship of Gynecology. The specialty of gynecology at San Marcos in the early 1900s was a surgery-intensive specialty at a time when heroic surgery was on the rise elsewhere, including the United States, and echoed throughout Latin American medical circles, especially as a way to prevent cancer from spreading from one place to another. Carvalho provided detailed accounts of all of his surgeries, and also he waxed very enthusiastic about the medical students who attended and witnessed the operations that he carried out. By the year 1906, most of these surgeries were hysterectomies, which were prescribed for a wide variety of diagnoses, the most important of which were uterine fibroids, endometrial infections, uterine prolapses, and cervical cancers. In the early 1900s, there is very little evidence of cancer sufferers consenting to surgical treatment or considering it a valuable sort of intervention. And instead, what we have is a lot of evidence from patients speaking about the horrific long-term pain of cancer, the suffering, the disability that it caused, and also the loss of livelihoods resulting from cancer. The frequent result of these intersecting conditions was often a last resort hospital visit that shocked physicians who, they witnessed the generalized poor state of cancer patients and then turned around and in frustration, possibly blamed patients themselves for not seeking care sooner. This is a familiar story in the history of cancer care in the United States as well at the time. Another factor that is more, I guess, Peruvian against the establishment of surgery as the go-to treatment against cancer was popular reliance on non-allopathic healers, especially Chinese ones. Throughout the 1900s and the 1910s, Peruvian physicians waged a fierce and losing battle against Chinese healers. They accused the Chinese healers of incompetence, of greed, and more specifically in this case, of practicing surgery in cases of cancer when they were, according to the Peruvian physicians, at best, simple sellers of medicinal plants. Despite these obstacles, allopathic medicine and surgeons in particular had a powerful ally in statistics. The Welfare Society of Lima, the Sociedad de Beneficencia, produced detailed statistics of morbidity and mortality by illness between the years 1913 and 1930 for all of the hospitals that it managed, which were the 7 largest in the country at the time, all of them located in the city of Lima. This table that you see here is a summary of the most commonly seen illnesses in these hospitals. The tables combine morbidity and mortality because that's the way in which the data was presented, and they show the illness labels that are used in the archive. Take a moment to read this. What we can say with these statistics is that between 1913 and 1930, number one, although the incidence of cancer in Lima hospitals did not approach the incidence of things like malaria and TB and syphilis or pneumonia or diarrheic illnesses, nonetheless, cancer counted. It was not ignored. That's important. Number two, cancer statistics were already disaggregated by organ affected. Number three, cancers in women's sexual organs posed the greatest threat. I haven't shown you the other types of cancers counted in these statistics, but stomach and breast cancer were distant second and third, respectively. And number four, knowing what we now know about yearly disease incidence in Latin America, these aggregated numbers of cancer massively undercount the true burden of the disease. Now remember also though, that these are just statistics of the people who were hospitalized and only in the capital, in Lima. This is where we must plug in a key surgeon who moved cancer control into the public sphere. His name I mentioned a moment ago. It's Juan José Mostajo, a graduate of San Marcos in 1913. And in a speech in 1918, he asked for the help of the Peruvian Surgery Society in launching a national campaign against cancer following his alarm over rising morbidity and mortality using the statistics that I have shown you earlier. The Surgery Society agreed with Mostajo's urgent call, and they created something called a Permanent Commission on Cancer Control as part of itself, as part of the Surgery Society, with Mostajo as president and Professor Constantino de Carvalho, the one whose photo I showed you earlier, as the advisor. This commission swiftly moved to place ads in magazines and journals, quoting now, to awaken the sanitary awareness of individuals without which the calls for early detection are chimerical. The commissioners also wrote letters to physicians and midwives and dentists as well, because they were convinced that patients would rather go to see those practitioners before consulting a surgeon. Generalist physicians were cast as the pivotal allies of the surgeons, since it was their advice that determined whether the sick person made the best decision. That's another quote from their letters. The commissioners also took special care to single out the challenges of diagnosing uterine cancers, given, and I'm quoting again, the shame patients feel about the physical examination, the repugnance physicians frequently show while carrying out gynecological exams, and their guarded optimism about postmenopausal bleeding, which they attribute to non-threatening disorders, end quote. Every irregular genital bleeding, in the commissioner's opinion, ought to be considered suspicious, and physicians should deny these patients any drugs, including palliative ones, and instead direct them to seek surgical or gynecological attention. When addressing midwives, the commissioners hoped that they would be, and I'm quoting again, loyal and effective collaborators, willing to defer to physicians in anything other than births and puerperal care, even if that meant loss of income. Gynecology, said the commissioners, here's another quote, is a medical science completely unknown to you, one in which you may not dabble without causing harm and usurping another expert's jurisdiction. In contrast, prompt referrals to medical care would produce, another quote, the noble satisfaction of knowing that you have contributed to the welfare of society and the nation. So check out the authoritarian tone towards midwives. And then that tone turns very alarming in the letters that are addressed to the lay public, which describe cancer as a deadly disease that could begin without pain and develop undetected by the patient. Neither hereditary nor blood-borne, no cause for shame, say the commissioners. Patients were advised to be wary of things such as intermenstrual bleeding, pain after sex, bumps under the skin, wounds that didn't heal, unexplained weight loss, persistent indigestion, moles that change color or appearance, because any of those could be signs of cancer. Now, notice the really wide net that they cast here. They are not interested in fine-tuned distinctions between different kinds of cancers or different kinds of approaches to cancer. It's more of a, come see us sort of message that they send to the public. This anti-cancer campaign had the kind of high visibility and technical novelty that captured the attention of Peru's president at the time, a man named Augusto B. Leguía, and his administration quickly brought it in under its umbrella. In February of 1922, the president named Mostajo the initiator of the campaign against cancer in Peru and tasked him with studying the organization of cooperative cancer control efforts between physicians, government offices, and civil society organizations elsewhere. And so Mostajo left. He left on a voyage of 2 years. He went through South America, through Europe and the United States, the better to observe how those cooperative cancer control efforts developed. From his trip notes, he appeared most impressed with the city of Montevideo, the capital of Uruguay, which he called it the most important oncological center of South America. He also traveled to Rio de Janeiro, to Buenos Aires, London, Berlin, Paris, and of all the places that he visited, Mostajo was gladdest to report on New York City and the American Society for the Control of Cancer, which had been established in that city in 1913. Mostajo called it the most perfect initiative of all that we have seen. Now, Mostajo's voyage was supposed to help him accumulate arguments and allies to appeal to the Peruvian government for sponsorship of an even broader anti-cancer campaign. So when he returned to Peru in 1924, 1925, and in cooperation with his old partners and colleagues from the Peruvian Surgery Society, Mostajo established the AntiCancer League in the year 1924, the second in South America after Uruguay's. Just as importantly, the AntiCancer League, which was headquartered in Lima, had affiliates beyond Lima in the northern city of Chiclayo and in the southern city of Arequipa. Leguía's government officially recognized the League in the year 1926. And several notables joined the board of the LAC, including the Archbishop of Lima, the Mayor of Lima, the Director of Public Health, which is the forerunner to the Ministry of Health of Peru in the present. This is in addition to the fact that the LAC had a scientific steering committee, which was led by the Dean of the School of Medicine, and also the President of the Peruvian Surgery Society. And to boot, the LAC included a women's committee that included philanthropists Juana Alarco and Mercedes Ayulo. If you are into the history of Peru, these two are really important names of female activists. Juan Jose Mostajo presides then over this fledgling but very promising novel organization. Its vision, he said, I'm quoting again, "Cancer can be defeated even if its etiology is not well understood, with the strong support of public opinion and well-run sanitary efforts." In fact, syphilis and yellow fever had already begun to be routed successfully in this way, said Mostajo. So why not cancer? The LAC's new, robust, and original plan of action went beyond information dissemination and public outreach functions. It comprised the creation of outpatient cancer clinics at 3 large hospitals in Lima to diagnose, classify, and count, but not treat cases of cancer. To further increase the visibility of the campaign against cancer, the LAC also proposed an annual Cancer Week to be observed nationwide, as well as the issuance of a cancer awareness postage stamp to raise funds also. In addition, the LAC aimed to create a library with materials purchased or donated in sister institutions in Europe and the Americas, not the United States. And the LAC's role as an information clearinghouse would also involve the continuous production of up-to-date cancer statistics to be compiled and then sent to generalist physicians. The LAC also envisioned creating a core of visitadoras sociales, which I've translated as visiting social workers, though the term social work it has a different concept nowadays. These visitadoras sociales, they were tasked with furthering propaganda efforts among the general population. They were supposed to help in the fight against charlatanism in the cases of cancer. They were supposed to follow up on patients' compliance with physicians' orders, and they were there for bereavement support as well. Lots of functions that these visitadoras were supposed to take on. And at the centerpiece of all of this, the LAC advocated for building a specialized cancer care center, so a hospital of its own. Very nice, right? Well, unfortunately, what appeared to be the moment of the LAC's takeoff and Mostajo's triumph instead turned to be the twilight of the LAC. This illustrates a really important tension at the heart of 1920s Latin American anti-cancer initiatives between, on the one hand, the desirability and the innovativeness of public engagement and the difficulty of finding an institutional home for that kind of function. For starters, President Leguía had offered a 5,000 square meter plot of land to build a cancer care center that the LAC envisioned and demanded, but he had not honored his commitment by the time that he was ousted in 1930. Also, Leguía supported cancer-related initiatives that duplicated the work that the LAC pioneered regarding partnerships between experts and civil society. It is not clear why he supported the duplication of efforts. I can speculate, but not right now. In any case, none of those duplicates matched the work that the LAC was already doing in terms of public outreach, with its involvement of public figures, with the inclusion of cities beyond Lima, and with the letters and lectures that they already did in schools and workplaces, and the involvement of international collaborators as well, particularly in Argentina. Meanwhile, the politically powerful School of Medicine in Lima almost entirely overlooked the role of public outreach, even though the emphasis on cancer as being rooted in people's living conditions was widely acknowledged in the 1920s. Instead, the medical school focused on promoting the need for coordination and resource sharing between different forms of hospital-based cancer care, which sidelined the relevance of non-hospital-based initiatives, such as the LAC. The coordination and resource sharing that is relevant here is that between surgeons and the rising specialty of radiology. X-ray therapy had been available in many Latin American hospitals in the 1910s already. In Peru, it was Dr. Constantino T. Carvalho, the chair of gynecology at San Marcos, who first brought the technology in the year 1897, so very quickly after it was invented in 1895. However, it was radium therapy that became the great disruptor of surgical leadership in cancer care. Radium therapy began to be systematically used in the women's cancer ward of the Hospital Loaiza in Lima in the year 1925. By that time, Peruvian clinicians were actively receiving training in older radium therapy centers elsewhere in Latin America, particularly in Bogota, Colombia, and Santiago in Chile. So keen were Peruvian physicians on the promise of radium that the Faculty of Medicine invited Dr. Claudius Regaud, who was the head of the Curie Foundation in Paris, to lecture about the technology in 1928. Dr. Regaud, when he got to Lima, he realized that he was stepping into a powder keg of interspecialty rivalry, and he made a point to say in every one of his lectures that radiologists are not the enemies of surgery. but he avoided any kind of mention of cooperation with the LAC and its non-hospital-based function. So, although the LAC languished without government support, without support from the School of Medicine, or support from the up-and-coming radiologists who were wary of the LAC as a surgeon-led organization, there was good news in 1939 when a specialized cancer care center was built. The Instituto Nacional del Cáncer was to be a part of the Ministry of Public Health. It was supposed to dedicate itself to the study and the prevention of the disease, to training clinicians, and to providing patient care as well. And it came equipped with a library and with housing for nurses and physicians. About 70% of its 113 beds were reserved for patients who could not afford care, which is an acknowledgement of the poverty of many cancer patients in the country. The Instituto Nacional del Cáncer meant the end of the LAC. For starters, the Minister of Health pointedly did not acknowledge all of the LAC's contributions in its official announcement of the Instituto Nacional del Cáncer, even though he did pay homage to another Leguía Era cancer initiative. More importantly, the Minister of Health, in his official announcement, said that the Cancer Institute's responsibilities, one of the responsibilities of the new National Cancer Institute would be to, and I'm quoting again, to assist the executive government in an intense social campaign against cancer, end quote. Thus, he was signaling that public outreach from then on would be handled directly by the central government through the National Cancer Institute from that moment on, from 1939 on. That kind of level of centralization did not make sense to all clinicians, not just Mostajo, but several others who believed that paramedical civil society agencies had a role to play in coordination, but separate from the National Cancer Institute, raising funds, spreading the gospel of early detection, and providing insights as to why people at risk of cancer failed to turn up for checkups. In their opinion, these functions were better suited to the skills of entities such as the LAC rather than the National Cancer Institute. But given the power of the new Ministry of Public Health, which had only been established in 1935, and buttressed by that trend to treat cancer care as a hospital-bound matter, it was the National Cancer Institute that had the upper hand at the time. And so in 1941, the Ministry of Health annulled the LAC via ministerial decree. And that was the end of that. Politically then, wait, little water. Politically, in the early 1940s, the balance of forces shifted towards treating all cancer care as a state-directed and hospital-bound matter, which made a non-hospital partnership of government, medical, and civil society actors, such as the LAC, at best irrelevant, and at worst a competitor of the National Cancer Institute. To complicate the situation even further, in the year 1942, the National Cancer Institute was renamed the National Institute of Radiotherapy, an acknowledgement of the power that was held by radiotherapy experts at the new institution, eclipsing the balance that previously existed between different forms of clinical involvement, particularly with surgery. An affronted and betrayed Mostajo wrote bitterly how workers were, replacing the name of at the front of the building. I'm quoting him again, as if it were a commercial establishment, end quote. And yet, For all of the new attributions that the National Radiotherapy Institute had, it did not improve on the LAC's outreach initiatives, but instead rehashed them while failing to draw on the accumulated expertise of the LAC's surgical organizers, its influential partners in civil society, and its international collaborators. As a result, the INR's public outreach function was simultaneously unoriginal and also diminished. It was buried in the medical bureaucracy of its prophylaxis and propaganda section. It stopped far short of engaging civic leaders. It did not extend its footprint beyond Lima. It did not raise extramural funds. It did not kindle collaborations with Peru's neighbors like the LAC had done, and it did not build a core of visitadoras sociales, as the LAC had either done or had planned to do. The INR centralization thus squandered a significant amount of all of the efforts expended by the cancer control pioneers of the 1920s. In 1945, a new director took over the INR. He was a radiologist, of course. His name was Oscar Soto, and he was gently critical of the ineffectiveness of centralized hospital-based outreach. Indeed, by the year 1948, he had realized that the way in which things were proceeding in his hospital had not managed to make much inroads among patients with treatable cancers. Most of the cases that they were seeing were very advanced, just as they had been earlier. And considering that state of affairs, Soto underscored the importance of establishing alliances with non-hospital civil society partners to publicize the importance of early detection among lay people and physicians alike, exactly as the LAC had done 20 years before. For Soto, examples such as the Women's Field Army of the American Society for the Control of Cancer was a good example. Cuba's Liga contra el Cáncer was also a good example for Peru, according to Soto. But what about the LAC, right? I mean, there was already a homegrown example. Well, according to Soto, he never answered that question, directly, but according to him, the decline of the LAC had been all but guaranteed when a cancer hospital was not built in the 1920s when Leguía said that he would. Here's a quote of his: "A league without a hospital will end up fading, with disillusioned patients unable to get care, tuning out the league's message. A hospital without a league condemns the hospital to keep on treating advanced cases and to yield extremely low rates of cure, which in turn makes the public lose faith in treatment and turn away from the hospital." Sounds reasonable. But Soto sidestepped the controversial political dismissal of the LAC by the Ministry of Health that had taken place many years before, while simultaneously avoiding making any overtures to the older LAC leaders who were still around, and failing to reignite the local and international professional collaborations that the LAC had set in motion and that the Ministry of Health had abandoned. Soto announced new negotiations with the Ministry of Health to launch a medical, governmental, civil society partnership, which he called the Liga contra el Cáncer. Sponsored by the Sociedad Peruana de Radiología, by the Peruvian Society of Radiology. And without a trace of irony, I swear, the guy says, Soto adds, "It is our well-founded hope that success will crown our efforts." All right. The tendency to write off the past plagues clinical and public health discussions to this day. This is one of the big takeaways I hope you consider from this talk. Soto did it in the 1940s, speaking about thinking about the 1920s. The new Liga contra el Cáncer that he sponsored finally emerged in the 1950s, and it did not acknowledge any ties with the 1920s LAC, despite the fact that they had exactly identical public engagement missions. Exactly identical public engagement missions, but the one from the 1950s did not look at all at the one from the 1920s. I don't know what to say about that. More recently, a 2017 editorial in the Lancet Oncology declared that Peru, my home, had finally taken, I'm quoting, a first step to reduce its cancer burden with the 2013 Plan Esperanza for comprehensive cancer care and prevention. It was a facepalm moment for me, truly. The editorial made no mention of either of the leagues, the 1950s one or the 1920s one, nor of the creation of the INC-INR in 1939, which still exists with a different name. It did not refer to the adoption of cervical cancer screening as part of the maternal health programs in the 1960s. Unexplained. And just a few years before that editorial, there was a Harvard-led global task force on expanded access to cancer care and control in developing cancers that issued a call to action that was predicated on the need to learn from previous initiatives, okay? Now I'm quoting, including those designed to address AIDS, tuberculosis, maternal and child health, maternal mortality, sexual and reproductive health, and mental health. But it made no mention of previous initiatives to care for cancer that originated in the global South. So it was a task force on expanded access to cancer care in developing countries, but it never acknowledged that there were initiatives already in the past in developing countries themselves. Another facepalm moment. The reality is that Latin American nations were taking steps to publicize the threat of cancer as early as the 1910s, and began to offer clinical care, pioneered and debated the use of technologies such as radium and colposcopy, and even formulated national cancer policies between the 1920s and the 1930s. In other words, today's programs and policies and collaborations related to cancer care are hardly being built on virgin soil. The professional medical societies and individual physicians who directed the first cancer control efforts in Peru beginning in the 1910s shows us the extent to which Latin American anti-cancer activists were drawn to examples beyond the United States and Western Europe as they traveled to other Latin American countries. Ángel Rojo in Argentina did exactly the same kind of trip that Mostajo did. He went through several Latin American countries, then to Europe, then to the United States, right around the time that Mostajo did as well. So there is a parallel Argentinian example to what Mostajo was doing. We compared statistics with our neighbors, and we exchanged training resources in addition. In other words, the emergence and the development of anti-cancer activism in Latin America includes features that cannot be studied in national isolation, but they have to be seen as emerging from transnational discussions that span the whole region. Already in the 1910s, several Latin American nations, including Uruguay, Argentina, Peru, and Brazil, we were already collecting hospitalization statistics. We produced educational pamphlets. We created specialized cancer wards. We traded in radium. We organized conferences, and we insisted on the importance of early detection, especially for cervical cancer. So the question is not why Latin American nations began to take steps to control cancer early in the 21st century, since this is factually false. Instead, the question is, why have previous efforts, such as the LAC, lacked continuity, or become invisible? This is a very important question as Latin Americans ponder their reception of new technologies, such as HPV vaccination, in the context of our existing public health programs. And that's all I have to say. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. And if you have any questions, I would be happy to answer them for the time that we have left until 1 o'clock.
Great, thank you for that amazing talk, Dr. Necochea. It looks like we already have our first question in the Q&A section, which we just asked that everybody put their questions in there, so this is perfect. So Chica says, thank you for this talk. I see parallels with this topic and what is happening today with COVID, and how the battle to fight this pandemic includes, especially in America, the battle in social media to combat fake news and encourage evidence-based guidelines and treatment modalities. With all the salient community figures on the original 1920s LAC and the Women's Committee, did you get a sense in your research that the public supported them?
Yes, I did. That's a great question. Yes, there was a great deal of public support for these things. Particularly, it's something that you can see through the participation of the Women's Committee. The two women that I mentioned who supported the LAC were very well-known female philanthropists, but they were also leaders of broader women's movements, and they were not super keen on just doing things in a maverick style. They actually represented women's organizations more broadly. Although we don't have specific voices of the women who participated in these organizations responding to the LAC, it is reasonable to infer that the female philanthropists who participated in the LAC were doing so because a large swath of their membership thought that this was a worthwhile endeavor.
Great. So Emmy asks, can you speak more on the religious institution influence?
That is a great question. We have evidence of involvement of the Catholic Church in the LAC. The Archbishop of Lima joined the organization. There is no good evidence that suggests the specific reasons why they joined. However, it was not unusual for the Catholic Church hierarchy to join popular initiatives such as this one at the time. One of the prime movers of the Catholic Church in Peruvian politics in this period includes not only the desire to be close to power. I mean, after all, the president of Peru was supporting the initiative, and it savvy religious leaders such as the Archbishop of Lima would have been wanting to get on the good side of political power by supporting the LAC. But there is also an internal logic to the Catholic Church at the time in supporting something like this. The social doctrine of the Catholic Church was one of the most interesting intellectual developments at the church in the early 20th century. The first encyclicals supporting a social mission for the Catholic Church came in right around the year 1897. And what they were suggesting was for the Catholic Church to not just, I guess, to not just remain in the pulpit, but to actually go out into the community and try to represent the best interests of the community that was, integral to the Catholic Church. And one of those big missions becomes health promotion. So it does make sense for the Catholic Church to engage in this initiative as well. I don't have any good leads that tell me why specifically cancer would have been something that the Catholic Church would have wanted to embrace. It is more that the social doctrine of the Catholic Church would have pushed the Catholic hierarchy to say, better health is something that we must embrace. But as to why specifically cancer, I don't know. I could speculate, that given the its rising visibility, it would have been something that would have attracted them. But I'm not too comfortable speculating too much beyond that.
Great, thank you. And if there are any more questions, this is your moment. Now's the time.
We can sing happy birthday to me.
We can.
But I did think about, a new tradition for celebrating my birthday could be to do some kind of talk going forward.
I mean, I think we all certainly appreciated you giving your birthday for this. So.
Oh, yeah, this is great.
Oh, great. Grace has a question. So, in the US, women's health has a history of being a taboo topic. Can you speak a little to the overall social stigma surrounding women's health in Peru?
It's the story, particularly regarding cervical cancer, is eerily similar to the United States. And one of the things that I have thought about often regarding that topic is that it still prevents appropriate care from being delivered, particularly in rural areas of Latin America. And it has everything to do with the point that the question raises, that women's sexuality is taboo, and especially that, well, because cervical cancer involves the reproductive organs, it builds on that, right? Here's what is kind of interesting also. The fact that we now know that HPV is responsible, well, it's a necessary factor in the causation of cervical cancer, has not desexualized the illness. In fact, it has extra sexualized it, because now we know that some head and neck and mouth cancers and some anal cancers are also related to HPV. And therefore, this has brought more attention to the use of those organs for sexual pleasure and also sexual violence. So the complicated relationship between HPV-related cancers and sexuality, it proceeds, and it's multiplied.
Great, thank you, Dr. Necochea, and thank you for the question, Grace. Perfect. Joshua has a question. He says, first, happy birthday. And for more of a general question, when it comes to medical literature, Who are the keepers of the historical medicine? We saw in the Lancet that major works are not only not detailed, but forgotten completely. Is there a good place to start outside of the primary sources?
Oh, thank you. That is a wonderful question. So great new work that is particular to Latin America includes right now very few people that, historical work. But one person that should be on everyone's radar is a Brazilian historian. Wait, can I write it on the chat?
I think so. You can try
it. Maybe I'll send it. I'll send it in a moment. Hold on. Where is my?
Send it in a Q&A question.
I'll send it in the Q. Okay, in the Q&A. His name is Luis Teixeira. It's Luis Antonio Teixeira, and he has been working for the longest time on the history of cancers in Latin America, especially in Brazil. And a lot of what I do sort of builds on some of the questions that he has raised, particularly this what I now think is like a super applesauce notion, right? That there's nothing really new about cancer care. We had been doing this for a very long time in several countries. Where I think we need to build on in Latin America is on the notion that studying the history of cancer only in isolation, in Argentina, in Colombia, in Peru, in Brazil, I don't think that approach is as productive as thinking about the development of cancer care as something that involves global circulations of knowledges, of technologies, of people. I think that's where I want to take this next. I want to just move away from just looking at a little country. And that goes for the US too, by the way. I don't think it's, I don't think it's okay to just look at, the history of cancer in the United States as an isolated phenomenon. Oh, I write things on the chat. Luis Antonio Teixeira.
I think you can send it to all panelists and attendees.
How do I do that?
If you look at the chat and then you hit 2, you can select who you want to send it to.
If I stop share, I can do that?
I think so.
Let me see if I can make it work then. Bloop.
If anyone has more questions in the meantime, feel free to put them in the Q&A.
There it is. There he is. I mean, he's a good guy.
I think you might have just sent it to the panelists. I'll send it to
I'm so sorry. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Great. Well, if no one has any more questions, I think we can give Dr. Necochea a virtual round of applause, which you should hear very loudly, and we can let you celebrate your birthday.
Thank you. Right, that's very nice.
Yeah.
And it's been a pleasure, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and thank you for coming. And I'll say hello, send me an email. Let me see if I can, I'll type my email here. And if anybody has any interest in discussing, I will, all panelists and attendees, I will be only too happy to, have a Zoom chat since this is all that we can afford these days, but it'll be good.
Great. Well, thank you so much again, Dr. Necochea. We really appreciated your talk. You're getting lots of thanks in the chat as well.
Thank you, and talk to you all later.
Great. Bye. Bye.